I want to perform a magic trick. For this trick, I'm going to make J.L. Mackie's error theory pass David Enoch's test of moral objectivity. What makes this a magic trick is that almost all philosophers take the theories of the two authors as diametrically opposed and completely incompatible. David Enoch's test of objectivity shows up in the article Why I Am an Objectivist About Ethics and Why You Are Too. In this article, Enoch provides a test that aims to prove that the reader actually believes that moral values are objective. Even if, on the surface, the reader asserts some form of subjectivism. In terms of how they use, make, and defend moral claims, their attitudes towards morality are attitudes that would only make sense on an assumption of moral objectivity. J.L. Mackie begins his famous book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, with the statement, "There are no objective values." In the book, he argues that all moral claims are false. The reason they are false is because moral claims contain within them this assumption of objectivity. And since there are no objective values, any claim that something is objectively right or wrong must be false. What I'm going to do is show that J.L. Mackie defends a moral theory where the moral claims within that theory pass David Enoch's test of objectivity. In performing this trick, I have nothing up my philosophical sleeve. I'm not going to dispute any of the claims that are at the core of Mackie's error theory. The following propositions will be assumed to be true. First, there's no such thing as objective intrinsic prescriptivity. This is what Mackie meant when he said that there are no objective values. There's no normative property of ought to be doneness or ought not to be doneness built into, for example, either rescuing a child from drowning or drowning a child. Such a property does not exist. Second, claims of intrinsic prescriptivity are built into the meanings of moral statements. When somebody makes a moral claim, they're saying that whatever it is they say is obligatory or immoral has some sort of intrinsic property that commands us to do that which is obligatory or not do that which is prohibited. When we combine these two claims, we can infer a third claim. The third claim from Mackie that I'm not going to dispute says that all moral claims are false. If all moral claims say this has an objective intrinsic property commanding us to act in a particular way, and there are no objective intrinsic properties commanding us to act in a particular way, then all moral claims must be false. If we accept Mackie's argument, then this leaves us with a question. What next? If all moral claims are false, what should we do with this information? Should we pretend as if they really exist even though they don't? Do we throw morality into the trash bin and be done with it? Is there some other option? Now, as I said, for my magic trick, I'm going to take Mackie's theory and show that it provides us with a way of making moral claims that pass Enoch's test of objectivity. We're going to create objectively true moral claims. Since I'm going to show that Mackie gives us a theory that passes Enoch's test for objectivity, we're going to need to know Enoch's tests of objectivity. The first test is called the spinach test. This is because it comes from a joke that David Enoch borrowed from Christina Korsgaard. The way that Enoch presents this joke is as follows, quote, "A child hates spinach. He then reports that he's glad he hates spinach. To the question why, he responds, because if I liked it, I would have eaten it, and it's yucky." End quote. With respect to something that's a matter of taste, the child's statement is, well, a bit odd. Obviously, if one liked it, it wouldn't be yucky, at least not to them. But moral values aren't like food preferences. This is David Enoch's point. Try this with a moral claim. I'm glad that I'm not sexually attracted to children because if I liked it, I would probably do it. And it's wrong. Unlike the statement about spinach, the statement about child abuse doesn't appear odd. The implication that Enoch draws from this is that we do not, in fact, treat moral claims as if they are matters of taste or personal preference. We treat moral claims as if they report some type of objective moral fact. The second test is known as the disagreement test, and it's been known as a problem for subjective theories of morality for some time. If one person says this chili is good and another says this chili is bad, This isn't a disagreement. The two individuals have different tastes. But if one person says justice requires capital punishment and another says capital punishment is wrong, this is taken to be a genuine disagreement. They'll get into a fight under the assumption that one of them must be mistaken. We have disagreements of this type over matters of fact, not matters of taste. So here too we treat moral claims as if they are matters of fact and not matters of taste. The third test is what Enoch calls the counterfactual test. There was a time when people in white-collar jobs were expected to wear a suit to the office. Everybody did this. That's why they're called white-collar jobs. Then suits fell out of fashion, and business casual became the fashion. That's okay. Cultures change. Morality doesn't work the same way. Let's assume that racism comes back into fashion. Is racism going in and out of fashion to be regarded the same way as the wearing of a suit at the office going in and out of fashion? If one answers no, then one is treating the wrongness of racism as if its wrongness were a matter of objective fact and not a matter of fashion. These three tests aim to show that you, the reader, even if you claim to believe that morality is subjective, treats morality as if moral claims refer to an objective moral fact. Its moral yuckiness doesn't vanish just because somebody enjoys doing it. People enter into genuine disagreements as to its value and treat those with different values as mistaken. And it's not okay for a moral wrong like racism to go in and out of fashion. My trick then is that I'm going to pull a rabbit out of Mackie's ethical hat. A rabbit that passes these three tests of objectivity. As a reminder, I'm not questioning these three propositions, all attributable to Mackie. There is no such thing as objective intrinsic prescriptivity. Claims of intrinsic prescriptivity are built into the meanings of moral statements, and all moral statements are false. Okay. Mackie, elsewhere in the book, devotes a chapter to defending a particular conception of goodness. In this, he ends up with the following. Quote, we can then offer a general definition of good, such as to satisfy requirements, etc., of the kind in question. End quote. What then are these requirements of the kind in question? Well, there are two types of requirements, according to Mackie. Particularly in the case of moral claims, there are objective intrinsic requirements, the requirement that the act or character trait have this property of objective intrinsic prescriptivity. But this type of requirement can never be met, since no such property exists. However, Mackie argues there's a second type of requirement. That requirement is being such as to satisfy wants and interests, and this type of goodness does exist. So what is this second type of objective value that Mackie's talking about? Here's what Mackie wrote, quote, something may be called good simply insofar as it satisfies or is such as to satisfy a certain desire. But objectivity of such relations of satisfaction doesn't constitute, in our sense, an objective value, end quote. To illustrate this second type of goodness, Mackie looks at functional goodness, the type of goodness we find in something that serves a function, such as a good knife. We don't call a knife a good knife based on its having an objective intrinsic goodness property. A knife is good in virtue of the fact that it satisfies or is such as to satisfy the desires of those who would use a knife of that type for its standard purpose. A good bread knife is a knife that satisfies the desires of those who use a bread knife for its standard purpose. A good carpet knife is a knife that satisfies the desires of those who use a carpet knife for its standard purpose, and so on. What we say about a good knife, we can say about the badness of pain. Pain is an aversion to a particular sensation, the sensation of a burn or a sprained ankle. It's a sensation we are wired to want to make stop when we have them, and to prevent ourselves from having, most of us anyway. If a theory did not admit to the badness of pain, that theory would be hard to defend. On Mackie's account, certain sensations are bad because they thwart or go against our desire to be free of such sensations, the sensation of a burn or a sprained ankle, for example. So Mackie looks at functional goodness and functional badness and comes up with the following, quote, "What is common to all these cases is that in each there is, somewhere in the picture, some set of requirements or wants or interests, and a thing that is called good is being said to be such as to satisfy those requirements or wants or interests." End quote. And just as a reminder, there's an objective fact of the matter as to whether something is such as to satisfy the wants and interests in question. It's just not the type of objective value that Mackie was talking about when he said that there is no such thing as objective value. Now, there's one more thing to cover about Mackie's thesis. Mackie said that goodness must, quote, "satisfy requirements of the kind in question," end quote. He had more to say about this kind in question claim. The requirements for a good knife aren't the same as, for example, the requirements for a good party. They're not even the same as the requirements for a good knife of another type, a bread knife versus a carpet knife, for example. And a terrible car accident doesn't thwart the same wants and desires as a terrible movie. In general, the requirements in question are different requirements when we talk about different things. We know what these requirements are through their context. Somebody who holds up a bread knife and says, "This knife isn't any good," we know that, if the statement is true, that the knife lacks those properties that would satisfy the wants and interests of somebody using a bread knife for its standard purpose. This gives us space to consider a second type of moral objectivity. Something can be morally right or wrong if it satisfies or is such as to satisfy the wants and interests in question. What could be the wants and interests with respect to moral value? Mackie provides an answer to this question when he writes about 3 stages of universalization. These 3 stages of universalization are 3 different levels at which we generalize moral claims. The third stage is a stage that is most compatible with his thesis that objective intrinsic prescriptivity does not exist. That is to say, there are no wants or interests that can be privileged on the grounds that they refer to things that are objectively intrinsically prescriptive. Mackie writes, quote, "In this third stage, we are taking some account of all actual desires, tastes, preferences, ideals, and values, including ones which are radically different from and hostile to our own, and consequently taking some account of all of the actual interest that anyone has, including those that arise from his having preferences and values that we do not share." End quote. So in the case of moral goodness and badness, we're looking at things that are such as to satisfy or prevent the satisfaction of all wants and interests. But what is it that we're evaluating according to this standard? Mackie's answer here is that we're evaluating actions according to whether they conform to a set of rules or conceptions of rights and duties, or dispositions or character traits that, in turn, are such as to satisfy all desires regardless of whose they are. Mackie says this, quote, "No doubt my approach could be called, in a very broad sense, a rule utilitarian one, but it would be utilitarianism without its characteristic fictions. And it would be not just rule utilitarianism, but a rule, right, duty, disposition utilitarianism." End quote. When Mackie says without its characteristic fictions, Mackie means without the characteristic fiction of objective intrinsic prescriptivity. Standard utilitarianism holds that something like pleasure, freedom from pain, happiness, eudaimonia, desire satisfaction, something like this has objective intrinsic prescriptivity that calls for it to be maximized. That is utilitarianism with its characteristic fiction. Instead, for Mackie, an act is right if it's in accordance with a good moral rule, and a good moral rule is a rule that satisfies or is such as to satisfy the wants and interests of those who use moral rules for their standard purpose, which is everybody in a community. Now we move on to our final step. Does this conception of morality pass Enoch's 3 tests of objectivity? We start with the spinach test. The spinach test notes that there is an oddness in saying that one is glad that one doesn't like something because if one liked it, one would eat it, and it's yucky. How would Mackie's second type of moral objectivity appear when talked about in this way? Well, here would be an example. I'm glad I don't like to molest children, because if I like to molest children, I'd probably do it, and molesting children would violate a rule, the general adoption of which will tend to satisfy or prevent the thwarting of desires regardless of whose they are. This type of claim has none of the oddness that we would find in a claim that takes moral value to be merely a matter of taste or preference. And that is exactly what it would take for Mackie's theory to pass the spinach test. What about the disagreement test? It would be perfectly understandable for two people to enter into a disagreement over whether, for example, capital punishment violates a rule, the general adoption of which will tend to satisfy desires regardless of whose they are. People having such a debate would bring in such factors as the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent, the value of closure for the victims, the possibility of rehabilitation for offenders, the social consequences of promoting a positive attitude towards certain types of killing, and the like. Since retributivist arguments seem to depend on punishing the guilty as having a property of objective intrinsic prescriptivity, retributivist claims can be dismissed as being false. Not only would this account allow for reasonable disagreements on moral matters, it would allow for disagreements to be handled in largely the same way that we currently handle them. The same types of evidence and arguments can be used, except those that depend on propositions that assert objective intrinsic prescriptivity. Those arguments would need to be removed from the debate. And third, what about the counterfactual test? Can moral value go in and out of fashion the way clothing styles go in and out of fashion? Well, being such as to violate a rule, the general adoption of which would fulfill desires regardless of whose they are, is not a matter of fashion. It's a matter of fact. If an attitude that tends to thwart desires, such as racism, were to come into fashion, it would still not be morally good on Mackie's account. It would be a regression into something that was bad when it happened and would still be bad. So this type of moral objectivity passes Enoch's 3 tests of objectivity. In showing this, I've completed my magic trick of bringing Mackie's error theory into agreement with Enoch's 3 tests of objectivity. What about Mackie's thesis that all moral claims are false? Well, all moral claims are false because they contain the characteristic fiction of asserting objective intrinsic prescriptivity. We can remove this characteristic fiction, cut it out of morality, and instead make moral claims that depend on acts fulfilling rules and the like, that in turn tend to satisfy all desires regardless of whose they are. We can remove the characteristic fiction, and when we do, our moral claims can be objectively true or false. And some of them can even be true.